Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Claire Obradovich, Program and Learning Coordinator at Faith Trust Institute. We are joined today by Reverend Pat Simpson and Kristine Cunningham, who will be discussing how to create trauma-informed faith communities. I will be introducing our presenters in a moment, but first want to go over a few technical details. You should be able to hear me through your computer or phone, as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you are having problems with the sound, please check that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you are having other technical problems, I recommend that you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and try to connect again. All audience members are muted. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me using the question feature on the right side of your screen. We would love to hear from you, so please use the chat or the question and answer box to send me your questions at any time during the presentation. We will reserve time at the end of today's sessions for questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. If you don't see the question box, click on the small orange arrow on the right side of your screen to expand the features option. Additionally, our presenters are requesting scenarios or case studies be sent in by audience members. As you listen to today's presentation, please consider a brief scenario that you have encountered with your own community that you would like our presenters to address, and send that in also through the question box. The slides that you see on your screen during the presentation will be emailed to you as a PDF later this afternoon, so you will have them as a resource. I will also send a certificate of attendance. Lastly, we are recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join us for this live session. So welcome to those of you who are listening to the recording. Reverend Pat Simpson is pastor of University Temple United Methodist Church in Seattle. Her leadership experience has also included leadership in rural churches, in a congregation of homeless women, 7 years as district superintendent, and in the teaching field education at Seattle University School of Theology and Ministry. She is a Faith Trust Institute board member and a Healthy Boundaries trainer for clergy. Kristine Cunningham has been the executive director at Roots Young Adult Shelter since 2010 and has been working with the organization for 7 years. She moved into Seattle's University District in 1990 and began working with homeless youth as an AmeriCorps member in 1996, before there were many services for this growing population. Over half of her 20 years in social service management has been dedicated to young people who are not housed, and she is proud of Roots' long service as King County's largest shelter for young people. Kristine holds a business degree and tends to seek practical solutions to social problems. Before I pass this over to Pat and Kristine, we are going to take a quick poll of who is here today. So please take a second. You should see a poll come up on your screen. And just take a second to fill out which category you fall into. And while you are filling that out, just a reminder, audience members, if you have questions, please submit them anytime using the question box on the right side panel of the screen. And just give it another second on the poll. Okay. And Pat and Kristine, I will now pass it over to you.
Okay, this is Pat speaking, and Kristine will speak in a moment. You can hear both of our voices right here at the beginning. We thought it would be a good idea to start with definitions, and you'll see on your slide one from Judith Herman's classic book, Trauma and Recovery. At the moment of trauma, the victim is rendered helpless by overwhelming force. When the force is that of nature, we speak of disasters. When the force is that of other human beings, we speak of atrocities. Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. And within that broad definition, of course, you can think of a lot of particular examples. Kristine?
Thank you. So organizational or collective trauma is when that impacts a whole group of people. So at any level, trauma is an experience for which a person, family, or group is emotionally and cognitively unprepared. An experience that overwhelms the self-protective structure and leaves the person, family, or group feeling totally vulnerable and at least temporarily helpless.
Let's go to the next slide. One example of people who are extremely vulnerable is, of course, children. And you see here a graphic that shows some of the adverse experiences, the outcomes from abuse, neglect, or an unsafe environment that follow children into adolescence and adulthood. Their neurodevelopment, their cognitive, social, and emotional development can lead to high-risk behaviors and other outcomes, even in early death. So that vulnerability sets up a lifetime of adverse outcomes. And on the next slide, you see a different sorting of adverse childhood experiences. This is something that's been heavily studied, and you can see in that colored box some specific examples: physical, verbal, sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, and then a lot of things that aren't just things that happen to a family or a child: mental illness, addiction, incarceration, abuse, divorce, or separation. When you think of all those things, then the prevalence becomes pretty obvious. Later on, let's do the next slide, Kristine.
Right, so if you think about trauma as a natural stress response, then you can imagine the long-term consequences. So, for example, a lot of the studies that came out of the ACEs work actually showed neurological differences in these children. Their brains actually formed more cushioning around them, and that impaired their cognitive capacity. Whereas as adults, we can also experience trauma, for example, whether it's a natural catastrophe or a human event like war, etc. So trauma can be both short-term and long-term. And as you see in this slide, it can get incorporated into how that person sees their sense of safety in the world.
So this is actually a protective response. It's a way people's psyches and even our bodies try to ward off further danger. So there's a positive side to it, but when the responses become something that interferes with fullness of life, that's a different thing. So physical, emotional, and even spiritual impacts can cause long-term damage. You see the triad of traumatic stress there in the graphic. The world is a dangerous place. People cannot be trusted. Life is unpredictable. I am incompetent. I should have reacted differently. All that should have and could have things. I am damaged. And then about the future, things will never be the same. What is the point? I'll never get over this. It's hopeless. When you get to that level, these are not helpful responses in a person's life. And you can begin to translate these into the spiritual and even theological impacts over time, and we'll get back to the theological part later. There are individual signs of primary or secondary trauma. Kristine, you were going to, I think, say just a little bit about secondary trauma.
Right. So primary trauma is when you yourself are involved in the traumatizing event. Secondary trauma, for example, this is really common where I work at Roots. So we're a shelter for homeless young people. And the young people are sharing their stories with our volunteers who are doing really great jobs of getting to know them and learn about them as young people. However, these stories are very traumatizing. We're hearing stories of young people being actively targeted for violence. We're hearing stories of young people who are being raped while on the streets. And you can't encounter that without having that impact you as well. So we've basically learned that everybody who works very frequently at Roots is traumatized, but it's of a secondary nature, just related to their exposure to the young people we serve.
And of course, in a church or a chaplaincy context, or at congregations of any faith, you have leaders who are caring for people in illness, in situations of death and loss. So that secondary trauma is in congregational leaders as well. So there are a lot of beliefs and behaviors that can be signs of primary or secondary trauma. Sleep and appetite problems, isolation in social activity, staying away from those who don't share your perspective, use of sedatives, zoning out. There are lots of ways to do that these days. Decreased mental flexibility. Things become either or. Startle responses, a sense of being overwhelmed, not being able to step back and see the larger perspective, that self-sacrificial attitude, church leaders will recognize that, and also a response to change where it feels like dying. It's scary and unacceptable, and a sense of helplessness or futility.
Next slide. Now, as you can imagine, there's a lot of study on individual trauma because we've been knowing about that for many years. We used to even call it shell shock back after World War II. However, organizational trauma is a rather new field of study, and how does a whole group be impacted by trauma? And so on this slide, what we're talking about is within the group, what are some of the changes in the dynamics? So you'll see power struggles be more common. People see members of the group in terms of alpha and beta, who's in charge and who is playing supportive roles to that in charge person. There are heightened perceptions of injustice or conspiracy. You'll see information and resources becoming hoarded. There's a sense that we're not all in this together. This group must keep their things separate from that group. Institutional memory is vaunted. So in other words, people who are new to the group are not cherished because they don't have this collective understanding of what the group has been through, and therefore they're less valuable. Very much a turf mentality, us versus them. And the types of leaders that are cherished within traumatized organizations are really strong personalities. They're seen as people who can protect the flock. The group also tends to have an inability to name or talk openly about group norms or even key events in the group history, which is the next point there. And so when you look at trauma effect within a congregation, what you'll see is that the group becomes less flexible, and as the demands of the congregation change or shift, the group becomes very entrenched. Not very nimble. Committees or cliques in the church become impenetrable and exclusive. So, for example, if your board of trustees has always been the same people for the last 10 years, that's a great example of that. New people are subtly shunned or are basically not given much value in these groups. Also, new ideas will feel like a threat. Leaders become martyrs, and they get the sense that they are the only ones that will continue leadership roles from year to year because it becomes a self-predicting sacrifice that I'm the only one the group recognizes as a leader, therefore I'm the only one that can do these things.
Oh, that sounds so familiar.
So the important thing to notice, just like Pat said earlier, that trauma in itself is not a bad thing. It's simply a wake-up call. It's simply an event overwhelming our coping mechanisms and telling us that we need better coping mechanisms, and perhaps that we need to shift our perception. We all have this illusion that the world is a perfectly safe and wonderful place until something bad happens. And then oftentimes that's a good time to reflect on, like, okay, what is the truth about how safe I am in the world, right? So what you'll notice in organizational trauma is those who tend to believe that the things that you saw in the triangle earlier about the world not being safe, they tend to attract others who like that perspective or who feel safe within that perspective. So kind of like the bird you see in this photo, they become kind of the dominant holder of the group and the group norms and the sense of security for the group. So when these folks who are traumatized as individuals have roles of leadership or have significant influence on the social norms, then that's when you go from kind of disparate individual trauma folks to a much more group organizational trauma dynamic.
So this suggests that becoming a traumatized organization or congregation is not inevitable.
No.
I love the ambiguity of this photo, Kristine. So that little baby under there looks pretty safe, right? So there's a positive side to it, but I can't see them going anywhere together. And it may be kind of smothered under there too.
Right.
Let's go to the next slide. We're beginning now to go from this more generalized information about individual and organizational trauma and shift into something more focused on the life of faith communities. We have used some language in these coming slides that is more oriented to Christian congregations, speaking of pastors, for instance. We may have the word church in there somewhere, but those of you from other faith traditions, I think, will recognize that these things apply more broadly. Congregational leaders need to respond to the presence of individual trauma in their congregations and to organizational trauma. And we're going to look at the individual things first. And we really do need to look inside and be aware of our personal history as we come into these leadership roles. Some of us are ourselves survivors of trauma. In fact, people who become religious leaders may have heard that call because they learned to do that extreme caregiving in their families of origin. If we carry that kind of need to be the savior with us, we better know it and be able to deal with it. And as we noted earlier, it's common for religious leaders in a congregational setting or in a chaplaincy setting to be experiencing secondary trauma as we care for others. I can think of times when I have walked out of a nursing home just ready to slam doors and shout at God because of the unfairness and horribleness of life. You know, I'm a conscientious objector to death and suffering in old age, and that kind of thing, if we don't deal with it in the moment and give ourselves a chance to debrief and deal with our own sense of loss and grief, sometimes can complicate the way we lead and the way we affect the congregation system. Second, we need to be sensitive to congregants who have their own trauma history. either in their childhood or as adults. Even in a rather small congregation, the odds are very high that we have people known to us and other people not known to us who carry that history within them. They may have dealt with it well and call themselves strong survivors. They may still have current situations that are harming them and putting them in danger. So appropriate pastoral care with individuals and families needs to take this into account. And it can get really awkward. You may have both victims and perpetrators, for instance, in an extended family in a congregation. Our preaching and teaching should keep trauma survivors in mind. So if we are bearing witness to something like domestic violence in a sermon, we also need to be aware that that may trigger or re-traumatize people not known to us. If we are trying to bring forth the role of an oppressive system in perpetuating trauma, that can be helpful to people in understanding what's happened to them, but it also can bring forth some really vulnerable moments. As we look at the people in our congregations, we need to understand that trauma survivors can bring incredible strength to a church community. They bring empathy and compassion and a sense of solidarity. But we need to make sure that people are in appropriate roles depending on how they have dealt with their trauma. Someone with unhealed, bleeding psychic and spiritual wounds may not be in a place to take on a leadership role.
One thing that brings to mind for me, as somebody who works with those who aren't housed or survivors of childhood violence, is the power of their stories as being witnesses to a larger group is really amazing and really wonderful to get folks spurred to action, people who might not have directly experienced that. But you raise a good point. That doesn't mean that the person who experienced the trauma should be the leader, should be the one who's rallying everybody. Their decision to share their story and the power of their story is really a gift, but one that must be handled really gently.
Yeah. And I have seen this particularly working with homeless and formerly homeless women, that somebody has made it through to a place of strength and healing and good functioning is such a sign of hope, right, to somebody who's struggling through a situation right now. And that could be true in an ordinary congregation as well, if we make it safe for people to tell those stories that they often keep quiet about. So we can, as people may wish to move into those roles of giving testimony, telling their stories, and even coming into leadership, a pastoral leader can help people work with their patterns of functioning, understanding that in a time of conflict or anxiety in the church, they may need extra support. They may need people to lead alongside them so that their vulnerability doesn't kind of spill over into dysfunction for the congregation. So let's go on to the next slide here. Organizational trauma doesn't come from people's individual stories, but the congregation's own history. The congregation as a body, to use that Christian language, may have its own wounds. And something that's extremely common is abuse by a past clergy leader. There's a lot of good material in the Faith Trust resources around clergy boundaries and the abuse of the religious leader role. But some common things are a congregation doesn't trust pastor or the rabbi or the teacher, right? Because that trust was betrayed. And that might outlast the time of the people who actually suffered that abuse. It can be the next generation, and still the church doesn't trust pastors. Factions and conflicts over these things can remain for years. Who supported that rabbi and who made sure that rabbi got kicked out. Those memories linger, and the teams can line up on opposite sides of other conflicts. There's often an adversarial relationship with the denomination, particularly in some, like the United Methodist Church, my own denomination. It may be the denominational authorities who made sure that pastor was removed, or it may be denominational authorities who ignored an abusive situation and let it go on. So there may be bad blood there too. And finally, anyone who comes into a congregation with abuse history, particularly if it was by a religious leader, can be re-traumatized coming into this new situation. There can be other things that just happen to a church. If you're burned down, or if your treasurer embezzled funds, or I'm thinking in my current congregation, they almost got foreclosed on the building in the Great Depression. And it's still a memory, an institutional memory. It may be that someone was abused or harassed or harmed in the context of congregational life or in the building. There can be shame about not having protected people who were vulnerable. And then it can simply be a terrible loss or a tragedy. Maybe the pastor or rabbi or teacher died in office, or even during a service. I've heard that story before. We have a congregation in this area which years ago experienced a teenager dying in an accident on a rafting trip. And a subsequent lawsuit against the congregation by the family of the youth who died. That's a terrible wound that can be reawakened. There's still some scars there among those who experienced it. So let's go now to the last of this series, Relevant Understandings for Pastors and Other Congregational Leaders. There are all these intersections, and we've lifted up some of them already, as we come into the real life nitty-gritty situations of a congregation's life. So the leader's personal and family legacy. So what I experienced, the strengths I bring from it, and the wounds I still carry. So the leaders, also the lay leaders of the congregation. So the chair of your congregation's board, or the president of the trustees, or the superintendent of the youth program. All of those people also bring their own family history, their own patterns of behavior. They potentially even bring secondary trauma from their own work. You got somebody in the church who's an emergency room nurse. They don't come to service in the congregation without bringing some of that with them as well. The church itself, or the synagogue, or other religious institutions have their established ways of functioning. It doesn't take too long, even in a fairly new congregation, to get to, we've always done it that way. And then, if you add experiences of trauma, there are things that surface in crisis or conflict that can be really counterproductive.
There's a great example of that. I was brought in by a church who wanted me to train their team on how to handle conflict. I'm a skilled conflict de-escalation facilitator. And once I started talking to the members of this church, I found out that it wasn't so much that they had fights that broke out in their church, which is like much more my experience with shelter, like, here's how you break up a fight. But that they had a homeless man who joined them for worship services, and he began to discreetly fondle women standing next to him in the pew. And what this brought up for this very small congregation was, how do we include members and people we don't know and still feel safe to worship? The man was charged and stopped attending, but the church was really shaken and really rattled. And I think they were hoping that somehow my 3-hour training was going to be the magic pill for them all to feel better, that they could now handle it the next time something unexpected happened. And that's the truth of trauma, is it something unexpected has happened that shows you you're not quite prepared. And what's beautiful about that within the context of a faith community is hopefully you're getting the message from the pulpit that, no, we do have these resources, like these spiritual resources, and this belief that, love will trump all of this stuff. But once you've been traumatized, it's a big temptation just to kind of hole up and not activate that deeper faith that something good really will come of this. In the case of this church, after our 3-hour training session, we did this really lovely discussion where they realized, oh, we could have handled that gentleman differently and still had boundaries about who we are and how we worship together, and what the physical space looks like, and how close we stand next to each other in the pew, and they just started, I could see their wheels spinning from this place of being very closed and how to handle this, to being much more open about places that they had power and that they could do things differently.
So you were able to lead them into a more nuanced discussion.
Right.
Rather than letting this trauma pattern of either or thinking take over.
Right. And it was great because at that time, there were members of their church that wanted to close off worship to people that they didn't know. Mm-hmm. Which would be the death knell of any church, and so this new frame was helpful for them to talk about how they safely could include those that they didn't know.
Yeah, and the other side of it could be, people saying, but we have to let everybody in. We can't say no to anyone, which leaves those who were being harmed, touched.
Right.
In a way that was damaging to them, leaves them unprotected. So we have all these layers of, we want to be safe, we're called to be open. And could you say a little bit about that larger context of oppression that frames this?
Right. Okay, so in this case, there's obviously a lot of societal oppression around the homeless. But there's also a lot of sexism about women and, members of the church that were male who felt like it was their job to protect the women, right? So there was sexism and anti-homeless rhetoric kind of going. And so when you are traumatized, those really tidy boxes we could put oppressed groups into become very tempting. Right? So basically, our faith calls us to be vulnerable and to not put people in boxes. But trauma kind of gives us this little nudge, like, oh, but hey, if you put people in boxes and you kind of shut your front door to people you don't know, you'll be safer.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I've noticed in what came out of the ACEs study is the more traumatized people become, the more rigid they become, and the less open to new experiences they become. And so in that case, trauma becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. And you've always heard the stories about bad things happening over and over again to one individual. And I would kind of point out that maybe that's an example of that, someone who's really gotten stuck with that worldview of the triangle that we were looking at earlier.
Or an organization, a congregation that continues to decline because these patterns keep it from being open to change and dealing with things well. Let's look at that group mechanics list again on the next slide. We already saw this one, but looking at it again, now more from a congregational point of view, power struggles, alphas and betas, injustice and conspiracy theories, information and resources are hoarded, turf mentality, us, them, for and again, all of that. Boundaries can be blurred while loyalty to factions gets heightened. That's kind of a paradox, but it's true. Wanting a strong personality to protect us or fix it, right? If we only had a better rabbi, if we only had a new teacher, maybe we go to a different congregation to try and find it even. And then the silences, not being able to tell the story, not being able to talk about what the true norms are, or even name who the unofficial and influential and perhaps damaging leaders may be. So it's all familiar stuff. I'm sure that many of you listening have recognized either current or past situations in your own work, whether you're a religious leader, whether you're part of a congregation, or you see this from the outside. If you haven't already, you might send a very brief scenario in so we can talk about it in the Q&A, which is coming up fairly quickly. Okay, let's connected issues. This is kind of an open-ended slide here because we don't have answers to all the questions, darn. So if trauma is impairing a congregation's functioning, how does that impact the larger relationships with neighbors, with newcomers, and those we serve? We've talked about that wall that goes up with newcomers, where people just sense that they're not welcome, that you can't get in here, or it may be toxic or dangerous. Neighbors can perceive a church in the same way, and actually this kind of thing can get embodied in the building itself. Do you ever have your door open? You know, how many locks and barriers do people have to get through to be welcomed into the building? And when they're there, how many people do they have to get through to be welcomed into the circle? So the impact is there. How do we become more competent, and then how does that change us? If we deal with the congregation's unhealed trauma, if individuals who carry trauma in their own lives can move forward in their healing, the congregation can begin to grow stronger as well. And that can get us more able to be a witness in the community.
Right.
Domestic violence, on sexual violence, on child abuse. But we've posed a question here. Do we have to wait till the congregation is healed and healthy first? Or can doing that advocacy work actually forward the congregation's own healing? And I don't think there's an either-or answer to that. But it's an important question to pose.
One of the things I love about advocacy, for me, is it balances out the message of trauma. So, for example, as the executive director of Roots, I am not dealing with secondary trauma. I'm not on the shelter floor every week like I used to be. And so it gives me the option to get to know young people and hear their stories without living it through their eyes as closely as I used to. And I'm pleased to see that there's so many advocates and social workers joining me today, because my message for you is the better you get at advocating from the perspective of those you serve, the more you're undoing that message of trauma, which is there are never enough resources. The system is skewed to work against you and work against the people you serve, and they're just going to keep on getting victimized. Right? That's the message of that triangle that we looked at earlier. The world's not safe, and some groups are just always going to get the short end of the stick. Advocacy is basically believing that there's a different possibility, that their stories have power, and they got the short end of the stick because there's some type of injustice or some type of flaw in our system. And if we just get that in front of the right people or enough people, we can prevent it from happening to other people. And so my opportunities to do that and take young people down to Olympia or to the city council chambers or in front of a TV camera have really been powerful, because what it tells the young person is, number one, their stories are powerful and valuable. And what it tells that elected person, who would much rather listen to them than to me any day, is that this is really happening. This is still happening in our city, in our county, in our state. And that this isn't just a myth.
I would say, Kristine, as one of your board members as well, that even the governing board is led into anti-oppression training, into advocacy. So the entire organization benefits from that.
Right. So there's basically a kind of a ground up thing that happens in organizations that have that listening, that have that safety around, if you're ready to share your story, we can use it to actualize change. But my caution on that is kind of like that open-ended question that Pat just asked us. Does that mean that advocacy is always the right answer? Are people always ready for that? No. There's definitely a lot of safety that has to be built into those groups that are considering that and the types of supports that they need. One of the things that we do at Roots that I really love is we keep all of our groups rather fluid and open, except for our affinity groups. So for example, at Shelter, we have groups that are strictly for people of color who attend our shelter, groups that are strictly for people who identify as LGBTQ that attend our shelter. So those groups are closed, and those groups have a safe place to talk about oppression and talk about trauma. But then the whole group then is much more permeable.
So let's go to the last slide. I think we've touched on some of the messages of optimism and hope here. To really work on this stuff, we will be promoting healthy relationships, good boundaries, and mutuality in a way that builds resiliency and openness and new health. Building in group agreements for handling the conflicts that come with change is important. Conflict is just part of life, especially life in a quickly changing environment. Trying to ensure safety and trust in that environment of hope and openness, and providing extra support for those in leadership roles, professional leaders, volunteer leaders, and praising and supporting those who do the work that makes us a truly inclusive, healthy, and open community.
And before we move on to the lovely resources list here, I have a quick story of a congregation in Washington, D.C. that had the tough choice of whether to join other congregations who moved out of the urban core and into the suburbs, or if they actually decided to embrace the urban environment that their congregation was housed in. And the radicalizing moment for them in this decision came after a man who was homeless was found frozen to death on their doorstep, with his hand touching the locked doorknob to the church. So a horrific event that really brought home for this congregation their choice to be more open and more inclusive, as hard as that was. So the next slide has our resources that we would love you to draw from.
And I think we're ready for questions or case studies.
Thank you, everyone. We do have several minutes for questions and case studies, and we've been receiving a lot of questions and several case studies. So I think we can start with one case study, and this is a case study that's more organizational, trauma-based. So it's a congregation had a pastor who crossed professional boundaries when becoming romantically involved with a church member. As a same-gendered couple, the church factions formed that the pastor group was using homophobic rhetoric that became quite divisive.
Kristine, why don't you start?
Right, so that's a great example of the intersections we were talking about earlier between oppression and trauma. So I think if somebody had really worked with that congregation to untangle the gender norming and the homophobic language that was going on from the actual kind of breach of trust that happened for this pastor to become involved with this person in the congregation, then they could have talked about the real issue. But my guess is that would have taken a lot of resources, and I think that's the struggle in churches, is that we have this one pastor, maybe two, and they're supposed to like somehow keep everybody in their flock healthy. So in the case like this, where the pastor again was the one who crossed the line, who's gonna like go out and hire all of the folks to untangle this one with the congregation?
Well, and I could say from a denomination that would send supervisors, superintendents, and bishops in there to try and fix things. And we often use consultants, including Faith Trust, in situations like this. Even with really good leadership and consulting, sometimes these things can't be clarified in the moment. Things are just too crazy, and it takes time to sort it out, to reflect, and to heal from these things.
Right.
So that it's not just intervention at the moment, but also that aftercare. When you get the next pastoral leader in place and a new generation of leaders, still you have to analyze and look back at this situation with wisdom.
Right. And not only time, but I would say a real urgency around group norms. How do we hold each other in these conversations? And not just put them down the road, because trauma is a remembered thing. It's stored in our bodies. So we really do have to work through these things before it becomes a part of how the organization functions.
And before it's really enshrined in bad theology, right? So if your pastoral leader betrayed you, can you even trust God?
Mm-hmm.
Are there people that really walk away from their faith entirely in these situations? The stakes are high. So let's do another one.
Okay, so here is another one, and there are some similar components of it, but we can see if there's additional thoughts that you have in addressing it. This person wrote, I had a situation with my own church. The previous pastor was asked to leave for his mismanagement of money and abuse of power. Then on the day that he resigned, he announced that he had cancer, and he died eventually. But half of our church congregation left our church because they felt bad for him and decided not to support the new pastor. To this day, they're still struggling to grow the church and heal from the trauma which happened a few years ago. What can we do? We are on the verge of closing the church.
Oh, what a heartbreaking mess of a situation. So financial breach of trust, it seems like a different thing, but it still is. It goes to the heart of how do we trust each other to give leadership, right? And I'm sure there were questions about whose fault it was and all of that and what was wrong with your systems, but you were on the verge of making a fresh start. And then you got to feel sorry for the pastor who is sick and dying. I don't know how you fix this. It sounds like the congregation's able to talk about it some, but if most of the supporters of that pastor actually left, there's part of the conversation that's really cut off.
One thing that comes up for me is I know people who are supportive of those who are actively addicted or those who are making choices we don't like. And I think one of the messages that we get, especially in Christian theology, is how to be compassionate to somebody even if we don't like their choices. And I think trauma can suggest that the pastor deserves fierce loyalty or for you to turn your back on them.
Either or.
Either or. When in fact our theology suggests that we can do both. And that's really hard to operationalize in a whole group of people. But I think in light of the circumstances, people are drawn to the either or, unfortunately.
We're not going to fix this one.
Yeah. So, do you want to take one more case study, or do you want to move to questions?
I think questions.
Why don't we do a couple of questions while we still have some time?
Okay, so we have one question that says, how should faith leaders deal with a perpetrator and a victim who are in the same congregation? For example, if we have a domestic violence victim who has left an abuser, but both the victim and the perpetrator continue to be active members in the same faith community.
This is Pat. I can take this one because I've definitely been in that situation. It's sometimes possible in a large congregation to have boundaries that allow both a victim and a perpetrator to continue going to separate services, for instance. But in most congregations, one person's going to end up leaving, and people will take sides. Perpetrators need a faith community too, but they need to be in a place where their status is known and where boundaries can be put around them where they're not going to do further harm. Particularly if somebody's been abusing children, for instance, a little different than the DV situation. So I would just say Faith Trust has some great resources about that, and there are other webinars in the archives and materials that you can turn to look at ways that agreements and boundaries and covenants can be made to make sure that no further harm is done.
The other thing that comes up for me is really checking in with the person who is on the receiving end of this abuse, because often control is really at the heart of it. So that when you check in with the person on the receiving end, you're really kind of asking about the ways that their former partner could continue to control their access to the faith community or control their access to friendships or social connections within the church. Because those patterns could be pretty subtle and would really require somebody to keep an eye out for them.
Yeah. Let's try another one.
Okay, so we have another question that says, as we think about secondary trauma amongst clergy leaders, what advice do you have for clergy who are experiencing this? What coping mechanisms or pathways of support should clergy who experience secondary trauma seek out?
I'll start, Kristine, and then you can weigh in too. I would say, first of all, that every religious leader would benefit from having a therapist or a clinical supervisor or a spiritual director or some confidential, skilled sounding board person to consult. And that's baseline, but it becomes even more important when it's a very stressful situation and there can be secondary trauma. These things are often highly confidential, so you really need someone who can guard that relationship. Good education and collegial relationships are important too, and getting a life is important. It's, again, this either or thinking. Often we think, okay, we just have to do more. We have to rescue everything, and that can be really harmful and make things worse. Kristine, what do you think?
No, I think you named the really big ones. In social work, we call that self-care, right? The place that you actually have a good work-life balance. And you know, there are groups that are good at actively looking at oppression and how it shows up in our work. One of the groups that I really like is reevaluation counseling, because it gives me a better language of understanding the places that I could be unknowingly perpetrating some of those forms of trauma and oppression.
One more?
I think we have time for one more. And there are a lot of other questions that we can try to send out resources for after the webinar. But here is one more question. What is the best way to initiate a conversation about trauma in my church?
I think it's kind of like we said earlier, trauma itself is simply that wake-up call, right? It can be kind of, you could see it annoying like your alarm clock at 6 a.m., or you could see it kind of with open arms, like, oh, here's something that I didn't realize I was unprepared for, right? It just really depends on your worldview. I think if you approach the conversation from that second perspective, then you're going to have a much more open conversation and hopefully less defensiveness from the person that you're approaching. Like, so this thing happened, and what it brought to light for me is we have never dealt with this. I think people might feel a little overwhelmed by it, and so I'm just curious what you think about that, Sally, and you know, is this something that pinged you too, right? So you kind of open it up to the person you're inquiring of.
So there's a one-on-one approach. The other thing that religious leaders often have as well is the privilege of the pulpit or the role of a teacher, where it's possible to frame things theologically, as well as providing information and initiate a discussion even before something happens, with the knowledge that many things have happened in the lives of the listeners. The classic case is the pastor preaches a sermon on domestic violence, and 5 people come forward and disclose what's going on or what once went on in their lives. And an issue is opened up in the congregation. People can find each other and begin to support each other. So sometimes that opportunity to initiate, even aside from a particular current or past issue, is helpful.
And Pat and Kristine, before we end with a few final notes, do you have any thoughts that you would like to share?
No, I'm really glad to see the attendance today. I think, like we mentioned earlier, this is a really new thing that we're becoming more aware of the impact of trauma on groups of people and on our beliefs. And it's really exciting to me because there's so much that's going on right now, especially when we look at the violence within our police departments, that the more informed we are about trauma and how it works, the better we can holistically address these issues.
I think, too, it's a very hopeful time. We have a chance to do better and to deal with situations in real time to minimize the damage that's done in the long run to individuals and in the lives of congregations.
Thank you so much. Before we end today, I just have a few final notes. Thank you so much, Kristine and Pat, for leading this conversation and sharing your knowledge and experience in creating trauma-informed communities. On December 7th, we have our Meaningful Voices online book club, where we will be discussing Faithfully Feminist, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim feminists on why we stay. You can find out more about that on our website. When you can also view information about upcoming free webinars on our website at www.faithtrustinstitute.org. When you close the webinar window in a few moments, you'll be prompted to fill out a short survey. We'd be grateful if you took a moment to complete it and give us your feedback about this webinar and any ideas or suggestions you have for us regarding future webinars. We really appreciate you being part of this conversation, so once again, thank you for joining us. And this concludes today's presentation. I will email the presentation slides to you later this afternoon. Take care.